One, they're going to have to come up with a plan for how they're going to take that funding and use it to leverage student change within their district. There's also going to be $5 million in competitive grants that any district in Connecticut can apply to. And again, this will be based on whether or not these districts can convince the State Department of Education that they're going to be doing something that's going to be really transformational in boosting student achievement. Now, in those statewide grants, preference and priority will be given to conditional funding districts. So even though, let's say Greenwich decided they wanted to apply for one of these grants and they had the same application as Bridgeport, Bridgeport would be given preference. Okay? So even though anybody can apply, preference is given to those districts, those 30 districts with the lowest performance and the most student needs. And so out of the conditional funding, Bridgeport will be slated to get additional $4.4 million. There's also increased funding for public schools of choice. It doesn't entirely close, but it helps bring students that attend charter schools to a closer per pupil funding level compared to the state average. So right now, the state funds charter schools at $9,400 per pupil. That'll get increased to $11,000. Also, districts will now be required to pay $1,000 for every student that lives in their district but goes to attend a charter school. That's something new. Right now, charter schools are not funded with local dollars at all in the state of Connecticut, so this is the first move of any local funding to support charter school students. It also will allow for expanded growth of the charter school presence in Connecticut by opening 5 new state-authorized charter schools. In terms of early childhood education, Maria alluded to the fact that even when students come to kindergarten in Bridgeport, they're already at a disadvantage. The governor's bill tries to address that by offering funding for 500 new slots in pre-K programs for high-needs students, some of which presumably would be in Bridgeport. But it's also going to establish a rating system for pre-K programs across the state. The idea being that as these programs are rated, they're not only going to see where they stand compared to their peers, but also have a target and specific areas where they can improve upon to get a higher rating. So they'll be able to know exactly what the state wants to see from them, from their academic program, from what kind of environment they're setting up for the children. They're going to have a very clear idea of what they need to do to improve themselves. So this is something that a lot of other states have already implemented. Maryland has done a really good job implementing this, and not having one of these established is one of the major reasons that we didn't get any of the early childhood race to the top money that we just heard about, that Connecticut once again lost out on race to the top funding, because a lot of other states have already done this. So this is something that Connecticut has needed for a while and will finally hopefully become implemented. So just kind of overall, looking at the bill as a whole, we've kind of broken it up into 3 levels of kind of excitement or disappointment. The strongest part of this bill is the new accountability framework and the ability for the State Department of Education to turn around schools. As I'm sure everybody in this room knows, we've had a lot of schools in the state for a very long time that have not been getting students where they need to be academically. And there just hasn't been those levers for change at the state level to allow them to intervene as strongly as this bill would. So that's something that's very encouraging to see. Also, the new teacher and school leader policies around evaluation and tenure are very encouraging as well, because it'll hopefully allow for a change in culture within schools to focus more on development of teachers with respect to how they're driving student achievement and granting tenure based on student achievement rather than time in the school. Some promising elements: the conditional funding and increased funding for schools of choice is something that we're excited to see, but it's still not a full solution for the school funding problem in Connecticut. We still will fund students at charters, magnets, open choice, vocational schools in entirely different and inequitable ways. So while this bill does send more money to areas of need, it's not establishing a funding system that makes sense for Connecticut. And by that I mean it doesn't establish a system that's based on student need and making sure that students have the funding that they need at whatever public school they attend. Another weakness of this bill, it doesn't address the problem of last in, first out layoffs. So while this new teacher evaluation system is becoming a reality, until it's established, districts will still be vulnerable to laying off teachers that may be highly effective due to budget-driven constraints. Also, the bill doesn't address a problem with binding arbitration in Connecticut. And so binding arbitration, if you don't know what that is, when a Board of Education and a teachers union are renegotiating a contract and they are at an impasse and can't come to an agreement, it goes to what is called binding arbitration. And they'll sit down with 3 lawyers, one from each side, and a neutral party, and they have to decide whose last best offer to accept. Now, right now in statute, there's a whole list of factors that this panel is supposed to consider. What are other school districts doing? What's going to be, standard conditions for teachers across the state? A whole list of reasons, but not one of them is what's the student's best interest. And so one thing we'd like to see is having students' interests placed at the very top of that list. So when these this arbitration panel sits down to decide who's got the best offer on the table, they have to place the most weight on what's going to be best for the kids in that school district. So that's kind of a lot of information right now. I'm sure you guys have a lot of questions about the bill. So with that, I think we'll
just get to the next slide.
Open it up to Q&A.
Yeah, so I also, before we do, thank you, Alex, for sharing that. That is a lot of information. We're recording this session, and we're also going to have the PowerPoints available on our website. But before we get to Q&A, I just wanted to introduce the Executive Director of the Connecticut Policy Institute, Ben Zimmer, is joining us. Ben, can you just come on?
Sure.
Thank you for coming. So I'd just like to have Ben and Alex up here just to address any questions. I have a few questions, but I want to open it up to the audience first if there are any concerns or questions that you'd like to have addressed.
I'd like to hear more about your organization. Unfortunately, I
Sure.
have not heard more. So, in
Yeah.
third grade English?
Sorry.
In third grade English?
Yeah, absolutely. So we, you probably haven't heard of us because we only recently came into existence.
And tell me again.
So it's called the Connecticut Policy Institute. And if you'd like to visit our website, you can go to www.ctpolicyinstitute, all one word, .org. And the idea of the Connecticut Policy Institute is to try to start off what I guess would sort of, an analogy would be a kind of Brookings Institute type organization for the state of Connecticut. The idea is that there's
Lower
Okay.
third grade. Lower third grade.
So the idea is that there's a lot of the policy in Connecticut and the bills and the laws don't get drafted from the perspective of what policy makes sense, but often end up coming out of certain political special interest groups. They end up coming out of different sort of political considerations. And the idea of our organization is to be a nonpartisan, research-based group that comes up with papers and recommendations related to policy. So, I'll give one example of this. Is one of the papers we put out recently was on the Connecticut's job creation strategies. There have been a number of bills that were passed last term, several with bipartisan support, that we actually felt contained certain major problems because they were designed largely out of political considerations and focused on, providing certain tax breaks and benefits to special interest groups within various communities rather than promoting sustainable economic policy. And so another area where we're hoping to get involvement with is within education policy as well, and working with other organizations that are focused on this to think about how to do this in an appropriate way. So does that help answer? Or?
It does, but I'm wondering what the next step is. So, with that said, you do what for us, the public?
So I'd say we do three things in particular. One is we produce papers, so you can go to our website and see them, And the idea is that they, in simple and plain English, help explain some of these issues. Another is just to serve as a resource for staying up to date on Connecticut government issues. So rather than having to, read through all the different newspapers and articles going on in Connecticut, you can go to the website and 2 to 3 times a week we update it with what are the big news developments. So we have one post that was on the introduction of this bill where we outline in a similar way, though with fewer bullets, what are some of the key parts of the bill, and then we link to various news coverage of it as well as to the bill itself. So you could just go to one place and say, hey, here's what's going on. And when there are two sides, often there are different perspectives and different sides, and we try to, even if on a certain issue we might have, as our institution, one take on it, we will try to link to, organizations that are providing different perspectives. And then the third thing we do is try to organize, public community events to discuss certain issues. So we had held, in January, we held a forum on one aspect of education reform, the issues and the pros and cons of public school choice. So a representative from ConnCAN was there. We had a representative, Holder Winfield, from New Haven, who's a state representative, spoke. We had the head of TFA, Teach for America, Connecticut, was there. And Steve Adamowski, who was the former superintendent of the Hartford Public Schools. So the idea is sort of, to answer your question, those are the three sort of specific types of things. And they had kindly invited me here, so I'm happy to sort of, help.
Was that last time you talked about in Hartford, New Haven?
It was in New Haven, but the idea is that events will be throughout the state. So we'll have some in Hartford as well. Probably the plurality, the focus would be in Hartford because that's where the government is based. But the idea is also to have events throughout the state where other people can come. So we had that one in New Haven. Hopefully we'll be having some in Bridgeport soon, and especially as we get off the ground and build up our own organization, we'll be able to do these things with more frequency.
Thanks. I think, did you have a question, Rebecca?
Yes,
Sure.
absolutely.
Okay.
But you had a slide up there that showed that Bridgeport's at 30%, New Haven at 32%, and Hartford at 37%. How far back does that data go? Because I know Hartford has been working religiously on education for a number of years. New Haven, in the last 2 or 3 years, has really invested a lot of money and a lot of political will behind education, and Bridgeport hasn't had that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, is that the factor, and was Hartford as behind as Bridgeport was, say, 5 years ago?
Even further. I mean, if you look before Dr. Adamowski got to Hartford, Hartford was behind Bridgeport. It was the lowest performing district in the state. I think when Dr. Adamowski took over, their graduation was something like 37%. 27%. It's now over 50. New Haven and Hartford on CMT and CAPT exams, they've had the highest rate of growth in the state over the past 4 years. They've been growing at, I want to say it's something about 4 or 5 points compared to other urban districts. They're far outpacing them. So what's happening in New Haven and in Hartford is working in those communities, and to be sure, they haven't found the answer yet. They're still very far behind where the rest of the state is, but they're on the right trajectory. And so some of the things that they're doing, I think, are included in this bill. So one thing that they have adopted in both these districts is a model where they look at school performance and they find the lowest performing schools, they give them support, but if they're not performing after a few years, they'll shut the schools down and start up with a new model. So you heard me talk about the commissioner's network of schools, where the state's going to take over 25 of our lowest performing schools potentially. The idea being is